Good morning, everybody. Tom, real quick, before anything, I have to tell you, once I started telling people that we were getting Tom Holland on, the amount of ridiculously stupid and annoying Spider-Man jokes that I heard, I can't imagine what your poor life is like listening to the people who think they're original and making a Spider-Man joke.
As you say, they're brilliantly original jokes, and I laugh every time.
Oh man, I'm like, how, guys? You think he hasn't heard this one before? Like,
well,
seriously.
That's what I especially love. I especially love people who think that they might be the first people to make the joke. They just get me.
So what I really want to do is something about the way you wrote the book that really resonated with me, because we had a very similar experience growing up where I was raised in a very Christian home. But when I was in 9th grade, which was that would make me about 15 in America. I don't know how you guys do the grading in England, but so at 15, we start learning about Greek mythology. And something about Greek mythology, it was like my heart and my mind went on fire. Like I really fell in love with the Greek myths. I love learning about Oedipus and and I actually said to my English teacher, I said, how did these people believe this nonsense? So he wrote out the Apostles' Creed on the chalkboard, and he wrote, I believe in Zeus, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and in Hercules, his only son, our Lord. And he wrote it out like that, and it shattered my faith, because I started thinking like, wow, I believe in a total nonsense story, and it completely shattered my faith. Fast forward a little bit, I learn about the Roman Empire, and the same thing happens where my head and my heart light up again. And I'm like, I love learning about the Roman Empire. And I didn't get that feeling again until years later when I started seeing the Hebrew scriptures revealed in the Christian story, and seeing that those three stories, the Greek, the Roman, and the Hebrew scriptures, come together and form Christendom. And it just explodes on the earth, and it really enlivened my heart. And you had told a story about you having something very similar about your upbringing, where you really did love these ancient civilizations so much. And I don't even know how to form this in a question, but maybe just give us a little background about how you, growing up, those stories really resonated with you.
So I was raised as an Anglican. My mother, who is still very much alive, is a very devout Anglican. Christianity was very important to her. So I went to church. I unbelievably sang in the choir. I mean, I have the world's worst voice. And I went to Sunday school. And I loved the Bible stories. I mean, I really loved all that. You know, the Old Testament especially. But what I liked best about them were the episodes that involved ancient empires. And I was essentially, as you say, I was on the side of the ancient empires, because I was the kind of boy who loved dinosaurs. And what I loved about dinosaurs was basically the fact that they were fierce and they were glamorous, and they were kind of safely extinct. And, you know, whether it's ancient Egypt or Babylon or Rome, these seem to me to be the kind of historical equivalent of a tyrannosaur or an allosaur. I mean, glamorous, predatory, terrifying. So when I read about, say, the children of Israel escaping Egypt, I was wholly on the side of Pharaoh, because the children of Israel were just a bunch of hairy scruffs, whereas Pharaoh, you know, I mean, he had kind of linen skirts and chariots and tremendous headgear and gold, and it was just fabulous. But what I especially loved was Rome and Greece, because I had simultaneously got very, very into the Greek myths. And I think I found the Greek gods, again, a bit like the way that I preferred Pharaoh, say, to Moses, because Pharaoh just seemed kind of more glamorous and powerful. I preferred the Greek gods because they just kind of seemed more charismatic, really.
Yeah.
They were kind of individual. They were terrifying. They were spiteful. They were cruel. They were often quite kind of, I mean, they kind of shit
Oh my
way.
gosh. I'm so
Um,
sorry. I just clicked the button again that I do all the
it's all right.
time. I didn't mean
That's
to
all right.
interrupt you guys.
And I mean, I thought, and in a way, I still think that Athena is a kind of the ultimate deity. I mean, she has favorites. She's very smart. She is perfectly capable of turning people she doesn't like into spiders. I mean, that seems a pretty good reflection of the way that the universe is to me, actually. So,
Yeah.
uh, I it was kind of a gradual process. It was like a kind of dimmer switch, I suppose, going down. It was never that I had a spectacular loss of faith. I always admired and respected Christianity because I admired and respected my mother. But I came to associate Christianity with kind of drabness, dreariness, kind of autumn gales, that kind of thing. And it was almost synesthetic that my idea of Greece and Rome, it would always be blue skies, it would be summer, gleaming
Yeah.
temples, and then monks turn up and ruin it.
So
they're absolute killjoys.
You had told a story about so they asked you to write I don't know if it was an article or a book on ISIS, right? I don't know.
I did a TV show, a documentary.
And you went and you saw the Roman cross used in a way that like really irked you, right? Like people who didn't view the cross the same way.
Irk is not remotely an adequate word to express how I felt. So this was in 2016. So it was 2 years after ISIS had swept from Syria into northern Iraq, and you remember they occupied Mosul, and they had also occupied a town called Sinjar, which was the home to a people called the Yazidis. I'm sure that you and listeners may be familiar with them, but if not, they're a people who follow a very kind of syncretic faith. So elements of Christianity, elements of Islam, elements of Judaism, elements of Zoroastrianism. It may be even elements of kind of worship of the ancient Babylonian gods. I mean, kind of an amazing fusion of different beliefs. But they were viewed by ISIS as not just pagans, but as devil worshippers, and therefore a people basically to be destroyed, to be treated as the Romans had treated them. And so they rounded up the women and girls as young as 8. And if they found them sexually attractive, then they enslaved them, carried them off to slave markets. And the men they killed, and some of the men they crucified. And we got to go to Sinjar because we were in Kurdistan and the Kurds were fighting ISIS. And I think they realized that what we wanted, we were making a film that was basically trying to explain what were the theological justifications for what ISIS were doing. We were trying to understand ISIS in their own terms. Why were they targeting Christians? Why were they targeting Yazidis? And I think that the Kurdish government thought that this would be helpful for their profile in Britain. So they gave us permission to go to Sinjar, and it had just been recaptured a few weeks earlier by the Kurds. So it was still basically a war zone. And I think if I had gone knowing that I'd be going to a war zone, I would never have gone, because I'm a natural coward. It's absolutely not my bag going to war zones. And it was the most terrifying experience because we were we were within artillery range, and this was a time when ISIS were busy chopping off the heads of Western hostages, and we as Westerners were absolutely, we were very, very valuable commodities, and there were all kinds of people who would cheerfully have wanted $200,000 or whatever the asking rate was to grab us and hand them over. And that was very, very frightening. But what opened this kind of existential abyss before us was being in this place that had been treated as the legions had treated cities, and being brought up absolutely front to what that meant in reality. So all those children's books that I'd read where I said, oh, I kind of identified with the glamour and the excitement of it. I absolutely didn't, standing in this place that stank of heat and death, and knowing that there were people who had been crucified for reasons that the Romans had crucified people, and that these people who were within striking distance viewed the cross, as the Romans had viewed the cross, as an emblem of their power and their right to torture to death those who opposed them. And so 2,000 years of cultural inheritance, which for us in the West and for those of a Christian background everywhere, means that the cross serves as a kind of symbolic representation of this deep-seated conviction that in the long run, the weak will be are more valuable than the strong, that the powerless are more significant than the powerful, that the person who is tortured has a kind of moral value that is greater than the person who is doing the torture. All that was gone because I was up against people who didn't believe that at all. And so I had begun writing Dominion at that point, and I came back and I rewrote the introduction to it to put a massive premium on the crucifixion, because in a way I think that the emblem of the cross, it's right that it should be the emblem of Christianity because it is symbolic of everything that is most subversive, and to be frank, in the context of the world into which it came, countercultural, and which perhaps even Christians today have been anesthetized to. And certainly, I think the kind of the post-Christian world has.
So I just have to say something about the the introduction to Dominion. So I'm now I read the book 3 years ago, and the introduction alone, like if anybody has not purchased this book, the introduction alone is such a deep reflection and meditation on crucifixion, because I don't think any of us just seeing maybe a crucifix in a church really understand the scandal of the cross to the Jewish people, that if you even laid eyes on a crucified person, you were considered defiled. And as a Christian who understood the Christian story and who is deeply devout, that introduction was like, it really struck me to my heart and made me really reflect upon even my own anesthetization, like you just said, how desensitized I am to the power of this emblem. That we essentially, if you saw a culture that was worshiping a person who got their head chopped off in a guillotine, like that's essentially what we look to as our God. Like it's a symbol of torture, and I don't think we reflect upon it nearly enough.
The whole point of a guillotine is that it's quick.
Yes.
You put your head and chop, and it's off. I mean, that's the whole point of it. It's meant to be progressive. It's a progressive way of killing people. The whole thing about crucifixion is that it's protracted and agonizing, and that agony is for public entertainment.
Yeah.
So the humiliation of it and the kind of the fact that it is not quick is precisely the point. And that's why for the Romans, it's paradigmatically the punishment that is visited on rebellious slaves. And for the Romans, provincials who are kind of insurgent against Caesar are seen as slaves who are rebellious, because if you're a subject people who've submitted rather than fighting on, then you take on the characteristics of slaves. So that is why it is shocking for the Romans. I mean, it's the most unthinkable thing that someone who has suffered this particular fate could in some way be, not just divine, but part of the one God who governs the entire world. Absolute madness. The thing for in antiquity, it's not the idea that a human can become divine, because obviously the Romans entirely accept that. Pontius Pilate, his base is a city called Caesarea, which is named after a god, Augustus Caesar, who sits at the right hand of his own father, Julius Caesar, who likewise has become a god. So that's not the stumbling block. That's not, Paul's word. That's not the thing that makes it seem ridiculous. It's the fact that it's someone who suffered the death of a slave who should be elevated to the heavens. That's the lunacy. The last becoming first.
So if you see our channel, you have Babylon written right below you, because our channel name is Avoiding Babylon. And as I'm reading the book, I was so upset you started at Persia. I'm like, why didn't you go back a little further? So you really do take us into this, the setting the stage for the Christianity entering the world, and you start to explain some of these ancient gods. And it struck me because when you talk about Cybele and how the priests of Cybele would castrate themselves and they would wear women's clothing, and I couldn't help but start to notice almost the similarities in some of the things that we're seeing today. But it was like,
well, I mean, on one level, but I think that I'm not sure we'll come to this, and you may not agree with me, but it seems to me that in America at the moment, there is no aspect of the culture wars that are going on that are not expressive of Christian positions. So the trans issue, so the trans issue is the classic one, because on the one, you're absolutely right. Of course, the idea that a man can become a woman is absolutely contradictory to Christian teaching. You know, God creates man and woman separate, and the prohibitions against men wearing women's clothing are absolute. But against that, the reason why there is such enthusiasm and identification on the part of people, I guess, particularly on the left, with trans people, is the feeling that they are, in a sense, the lowest of the low, that gay people now can marry, that they have been accepted, that they've been the taboo that previously surrounded them has been lifted, and so therefore trans people are now the bottom of, you know, they are the equivalent of Lazarus lying at the gates of Dives, and that is why they have this almost kind of sacral role in progressive society. These are people who need to be lifted up and identified with if you are going to be redeemed, and that seems to me a thoroughly Christian idea. So essentially, what's going on in the debate over trans rights, it's not kind of Christians against progressives, even though that is conventionally how it is understood and portrayed by both sides. But more fundamentally than that, it's a disagreement in a Christian culture about what aspects of Christian teaching should take precedence, I think.
Yeah, that's actually a very perceptive thing. I mean, we would probably describe it a little differently, but I completely understand where you're going with that. So I really wanted to touch on this real quick because you enlightened me so much to how Roman society would view women in the ancient world, and the idea of like when you see a lot of especially like some progressive movements, like talking about Christianity as if it's this repressive and awful thing. I don't think people really grasp how women were treated in the ancient world, and that the idea that women and men are on equal dignity really is a very Christian idea.
Yes. I mean, obviously there has the church, because it is, I mean, if you want to put it in Catholic terms, I guess, bread of the fallen world, the traditions of misogyny are deep rooted in it, as every sin, every failing is, you know, putting that in theological terms. But if I'm not putting it in theological terms, I would say that misogyny basically seems to be the natural condition of human civilization, because obviously, by and large, it's men who have made the running because they are physically more powerful, and because they don't get pregnant. So there are kind of deep biological reasons for that. And whether the Jews, the Greeks, the Romans, I mean, they assumed that, and this is, I mean, all the more striking coming from rabbis, that to be born female was a kind of curse. So there's a saying that is attributed both to Greek philosophers and to famous rabbis, where, you know, whether it's Thales or a rabbi says, I thank the Lord for three things: that I wasn't born a slave, that I wasn't born a barbarian or a non-Jew, and that I wasn't born a woman. And for Greeks and for Greek medical theory, women are inferior versions of men. Aristotle thinks this. Hippocrates thinks this. Women are men who haven't quite made it to the grade to become masculine.
Femininity is a deprivation of masculinity.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, Genesis does not teach that, of course. Genesis teaches that women as well as men are created equally in the image of God. But what if you really want to understand what it is that Christianity brings to the to kind of the future of gender equality, the key place to look, I think, is in the letters of the man who is often seen as the kind of standard bearer of Christian chauvinism, which is St. Paul.
Yeah.
Because when Paul, say, writes to the Corinthians, and the Corinthians are Romans, not Greeks. They are members of a Roman colony that's been planted on the destroyed foundations of Corinth. And he's trying to kind of answer questions about sexual behavior and the role of the genders. What has to be understood are the presumptions that govern Roman sexual attitudes. And for a Roman, the binary is not, I think, as it is for us, based on gender. So it's not primarily men and women. I mean, that, of course, it's very important, but primarily the sexual binary is between those who have power and those who don't. And power is basically a free person, a free citizen with a penis. And that free person with his penis can do what he likes in his household to his subordinates. So he can treat his slaves any way he wants. And the key thing is that they are slaves, not that they are male or female, not that they are adult or children. He can treat them any way he wants. Paul is saying this is unacceptable behavior because if you're going to have a sexual relationship, then the only acceptable model is the relationship of Christ and his church. And he's casting, of course, the man as Christ and the church, the woman as the church, which may seem sexist to us now, but by the standards of the age is unbelievably radical, because the implication of that is that Christ loves his church. He's not going around doing unspeakable things to the scullery maid or to the page boy or whatever. And so that monogamous relationship, which has to provide the foundation for a sexual relationship, is giving to women and indeed to men, because men are as subject to sexual violence as women, potentially, a kind of incredible dignity that they hadn't been given before. And in the long run, the implication is Christ chooses his church. The church chooses Christ. They're not being paired up, by clan lords or whatever. And so in the long run, this is kind of providing the sanction for the ideal of romantic love, which, will become such a kind of Western ideal. Yeah. Up until that point, the idea had been that a familia, it's, what the Romans called a familia, a family, is much more than what we would call a nuclear family. It's a vast, expanded clan, and the clan lord can pair people up any way he likes. So the classic example of that would be in Romeo and Juliet. The Montagues and the Capulets can choose who Juliet and Romeo marry. But Romeo and Juliet love each other and they get married by the friar.
Yeah.
Because the church, in the way, is the midwife of the ideal of romantic love.
In the book, you really do show how the development of the Christian teaching on marriage unfolds. It's not an immediate thing. So Paul does give us this little seed, right, where he's speaking in the book of Ephesians, but it doesn't just immediately change everything. It's really these deep ponderings that these Christians are having and really thinking about, and you really see the culmination of it in St. Catherine of Siena. And when you get to that chapter on St. Catherine of Siena, you really see that there are still men who are they're struggling with infidelity and stuff, and you really see the church step up and say, no, men cannot do this.
Right. Christianity imposes incredibly demanding standards on men.
Yeah.
And it say to Muslims, it seemed insane I mean, it was one of the things about Christianity that they found weirdest and maddest. The idea that a man would be expected to have a monogamous relationship with a single woman for his entire life. Really mad. And indeed, to most people, to pretty much everyone in the ancient world, it seemed mad. It was a very, very culturally distinctive way of understanding what matrimony should be. And the church patrolled it very, very sternly because they knew that it was kind of going against certainly human instincts, but also cultural instincts. So the church's ambition to regulate the behavior of clan lords was also a part of this mix. So they put by the standards of the age, very, very strict prohibitions against what they term incest. So, cousins are not allowed to marry cousins, which was kind of pretty much taken for granted by everybody. And they say no. So that's another part of what they're doing. And it's one of the most remarkable examples of the remolding of human assumptions, because I think we are very tempted to assume that sexual identity is something constant, but it isn't at all. It can be shaped. It is kind of contingent. And when it comes to our sexual ethics, nothing has been more important on that than the teachings of the church.
See, I think that is what civilized the West. I really do think that when we talk about civilization and civilized people, I think that holding men to this standard and how they have to treat women is really what civilizes a people to the point where that's like you said, like that's where you start to get romantic love, right? So like the chivalry movement is born out of this whole idea that it really does come to the devotion to Our Lady, to Mary for a Catholic. We're seeing Mary as the crown of Christ's creation. We now see Mary as this this beautiful being, and men want to hold women up to that standard now, and it almost makes men, where women are veiling because they're these holy things. I mean, that's my understanding. You might have a different perspective on it.
So I think pretty much everyone in our society does think that men should control their sexual appetites and not treat, say, female subordinates or inferiors any way they want. And the evidence for this is the Harvey Weinstein affair, which happened while I was writing Dominion. And I was kind of thinking, well, actually, perhaps since the 60s and the sexual revolution in the 60s, Christian teaching on sexuality has been, it has kind of gone into abeyance. But the impact of the Harvey Weinstein affair changed my mind on that, because what was very notable was that effectively no one turned around and said, well, so what? He's a powerful man. He can do what he likes. Because that's what a Roman would have said. That's what most people from most societies would have said. The idea that a kind of power entitles you as a man to do what you want to your inferiors, male, to repeat, male as well as female, is pretty much taken for granted in the Roman world. But nobody turns around and says that. And it really struck me, and I say this in Dominion, that when the women's marches were held in the wake of that, and in the wake of Trump becoming president in cities across the United States, the most striking costume worn was the red robes and the white bonnet of handmaids from the TV adaptation of Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale, which is, among other things, a parody of Puritan New England. And Puritan, I'm sure for Catholics, Puritan's a dirty word, but but it's also a dirty word for people today. It's usually used as a pejorative. But actually, what they were demanding was that men behave like Puritans. That Puritanism was all about looking into the soul, recognizing and fearing the taint of evil there, the taint of sin, and reining in your own appetites. And among those appetites, absolutely, are sexual appetites. A Puritan husband and a Puritan wife can absolutely enjoy the marriage bed, but the good Puritan can't go around kind of jumping the servant girl or whatever. And so women were dressing up as handmaids, which is a parody of Puritanism, basically to demand that men behave like Puritans, which seems to me absolutely expressive of the kind of the weird cultural Moebius strip that we're in at the moment. We're kind of inhabiting at the moment, where people attack Christian practices or ideology for entirely Christian reasons.
Yeah. It's such a weird thing, because the idea that there even is, it's like, all right, so if even when you see like movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, or if you see even like the Me Too movement, it's like you have to understand, like, that really is the idea of standing up for the weak and the downtrodden is a very Christian idea. This doesn't exist in the ancient world. And you really show that in the book, that like a slave had zero value, and babies, they would leave babies on the side of the Roman road. And it wasn't until these Christians went and started picking them up and caring for them that we started to, over time, and it really was a development over centuries of really starting to see the human person have this dignity regardless of their standing in life.
Right, but it's a very counterintuitive idea.
Yeah.
The idea that everyone has value, and that perhaps the weakest and most despised have the greatest value of all, is very, very counterintuitive. And the corollary, the further, it's not just on the level of small babies abandoned on rubbish tips being rescued by Christians in the 4th century, which of course to most people seems completely mad. Why would you bother with this? But it's also the fact that I think humans are inherently tribal, that for us as a species, our family matters most to us, our people like us matter most to us, the kind of the various social or national groups that we identify with matter most to us. And so the idea of a kind of universal communion, that all of us should, that Christians in the Roman Empire were seen as aberrant because they claimed a kind of universal identity. They didn't tie themselves to a metropolis or to a land or whatever, to a particular language. I think that imposes enormous strains. And, in a way, the civil rights movement was Black American Christians reminding white American Christians of precisely this inheritance, that kind of prejudice based on the color of skin to a Christian is as unacceptable as any other form of, it's because it's tribal behavior of the kind that Christianity has always preached against.
Yeah. So now let me ask you this, because I really do, because you didn't just write a general history of Christianity, of where it spread and stuff. You actually go through the Old Testament, showing how some of these things are fulfilled in the New. And then you really do, it's like you had to read the church fathers, and you read the saints, the writings of the saints. Like, these were not, it's not just this is how Christianity spread. You really do show the deep reflection that these men took into their hearts, and really reflecting upon the crucifixion and the passion of Jesus, that really did affect them to put this change out into the world. So as you're doing this, what was your faith before you wrote Dominion? And then as you're writing it, were any of these things that you were reading, were any of them striking your heart, or maybe making you say, well, maybe there's a little more to this than I had thought?
Before I began writing Dominion, I basically, it was kind of a realization that had come to me over many years, and particularly writing about the pre-Christian civilizations, that so many of my assumptions were Christian, that basically I was Christian, and to imagine that that I wasn't was kind of, delusion. And I remember particularly I'd written a book about the beginnings of Islam in the context of the collapse of the Roman and the Persian empires in late antiquity and the emergence of the caliphate. And that kind of, I ended up being pretty skeptical about a lot that Muslims classically have believed about the origins of the Quran and Islam and the life of Muhammad. And I remember In the Shadow of the Sword.
Okay.
So it's about the relationship of monotheism and empire in late antiquity. And I remember giving a talk about that at a literary festival, and there was a Muslim woman in the audience who said, why have you done this? You would never do this to your own beliefs. And I felt the sting of that for two reasons. One, because I had felt when I began writing that book that I was neutral. I didn't believe in God. So therefore, I felt that I could stand back and write about Jewish and Christian and Zoroastrian and Muslim beliefs in an objective and fair way. But of course, that's not being neutral, because not believing in God is as much a contingent position as it is.
Right.
And so the reason that I have to offer an explanation for the emergence of Islam that does not factor in the possibility that an angel really did speak to Muhammad and that the Quran really is literally the word of God is because I don't believe it. And that situates me in a particular materialist tradition, which is absolutely the mainstream tradition of historians writing today. But it's not a neutral position. I mean, it is one that blanks out enormous amounts of lived experience and means that I'm akin to someone trying to understand a butterfly by sticking a pin through it and inspecting it under a microphone. But I'm missing out on something pretty important, I think, by doing that, about what people believed and what this, what these beliefs actually, how they functioned. So there was that. But there was also the fact that even when this woman was asking me that question, I had already begun to think, well, what are the roots of my belief? Because it was impossible to look at, the origins of Islam or whatever, without recognizing the way in which something always comes from somewhere. Nothing comes from nothing. And the whole idea that, which I kind of come to believe, that my beliefs and values were bred of the Enlightenment, and that the Enlightenment was all about casting off superstition and toppling idols. I'd already come to realize that was pretty much what Protestants thought that they were doing in the 16th century. And it's what Christian missionaries in the early Middle Ages were doing when they were overthrowing idols or chopping down trees that were sacred to Thor or whatever. And that ultimately this was something that went right the way back to the Hebrew prophets, to Isaiah and so on. And so I'd already at that point come to realize that I was kind of doing to my beliefs what I'd done to Muslim belief. I was kind of questioning and interrogating them and thinking that the myths that surrounded them were inadequate to explain historically where they'd come from, and to recognize, therefore, basically that I was in every fundamental that mattered, Christian. Now, did that mean that I actually believed in God? Well, not really, because I still, for all kinds of reasons, I found it difficult to believe. But I wanted to believe because purely from the selfish point of view of writing Dominion, I needed to be able to believe to understand what it was that was motivating Christians. If I had no scintilla of belief, then how could I understand them? I was still kind of looking at a butterfly with a pin through it. So when I read the Church Fathers say, or I read about aspects of history, Christian history, I would try and get myself to believe, a bit like I guess a kind of gay person trying to be straight, something like that.
Historical conversion therapy.
And I would go to churches that were kind of appropriate to the period that I was studying. So I'd go to, there's a medieval church in London that was originally part of a priory and then became a parish church, where both the Virgin Mary appeared and Benjamin Franklin worked as a printer.
Did you?
So I kind of thought that.
Just to ask, did you visit any traditional Latin mass? Did you see any of the
Yes, I
traditional
did.
Latin
So I
mass?
did that as well. Yeah,
oh wow.
I did.
Okay.
So I went to Catholic. I went to Protestant. I went to Quakers. All that kind of thing. I went to there's an African church just at the top of my road. I went to that. So I opened myself up to the experience of believing it as much as I possibly could, and I definitely felt the power of it because it was going with the grain of instincts and assumptions and beliefs that I already have. And what I found, so when the pandemic hit, so the book came out in 29, and then the pandemic hit early 2020, and all the familiar waymarks of life were erased. And so I started following the patterns of the church year. So I started, Easter, because Easter came very
Following the
quickly after
liturgical
lockdown.
calendar.
Yeah, following the liturgical calendar, the saints' days and things like that. And I found that it gave an immense sense of structure to my life. And I thought, well, maybe there are many ways to believe. I mean, maybe this is a kind of belief. It offers explanations for things that I believe. It kind of seems to hallow beliefs. So I don't know whether that's actually a belief. I mean, I guess you kind of have to believe in God, don't you, to be a believer?
See, I would
and
say
the possibility of that belief still kind of floats really beyond my ability to accept
I would
it.
say that, like you're saying, how like the intuition and the instinct is to be this overpowering, so like just to structure things on power. And I think you're starting to see that come back now, where people are really having like this understanding of like you see it in all the debates between, everything's based on power and all these things. So I would say it's almost like impossible that if there was no spirit of God behind these things, I can't see it taking hold in a people. Like it just seems so preposterous to say a slave is the king, that I would think. I'm not trying to push anything on you or convert you or anything, but
but to give a counter argument to that,
yeah.
So we talked about how basically we as a society have been desensitized to the power of the crucifixion as a symbol, and how radical and subversive it is. And I think you can kind of see how subversive it is in the degree that in the writings of Christians from Paul onwards, they're embarrassed by it. I mean, Paul is embarrassed by it, even as he is kind of exultant about it. The embarrassment is the point. And that's true for Christian writers throughout the 2nd century, even into the 3rd. And when Constantine converts, what's really striking is that there are very few images of the crucifixion, even as the Roman Empire is converting to Christianity. And when in the beginning of the 5th century, you do start to get images of Christ on the cross, there's no sense that, he's in agony. He's portrayed as an athlete, as, he's kind of buff and
you see that in early art. They take like the Greek.
Absolutely. So he's an athlete who has won, he's won the equivalent of the games. And it's only by the year 1000, and perhaps not coincidentally, because there's a lot of meditation on the end of the world and kind of what the purpose of the sense that sin may be claiming humanity. You get to see Christ dead on the cross. And over the course of the Middle Ages that follows, the concern with Christ's sufferings is a crucial aspect of medieval Christian devotion, to the extent that perhaps it desensitizes people. And by the late 19th century, the cross is an emblem of Christianity that has somehow been divorced from everything that made Christianity shocking and disturbing to people. And that's why one of the great paradoxes of the relationship of atheism to faith is that it's the most subversive of all atheists. Friedrich Nietzsche, who is the most profoundly understands, I think, of all modern thinkers, just how shocking it is. And he is shocked by it because it appalls him. Well, he finds it repellent. What he finds repellent about it is that he recognizes that it is a form of power, that to be the great discovery of Christianity is that to be powerless gives people power. And if anyone doubts that, you just have to look at the way in which being marginalized or disadvantaged in America at the moment has become, it's become incredibly important to the degree that people who are absolutely steeped in privilege are desperately struggling to find ways in which they can cast themselves as underprivileged. The lack of privilege becomes a form of privilege, and Nietzsche understands that this is the great seismic, totemic discovery that Christianity makes. So I think
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think that there is that it is possible to say that the discovery, this discovery is a kind of accident from which great fruit is born, and not necessarily see it as proof that Jesus actually was the Son of God. I think it is possible for a materialist, atheist perspective on this as well.
Yeah, see, especially with Nietzsche's arguments, I actually think that I think C.S. Lewis really does a good job of this in his Mere Christianity, where he talks about like the very idea that there is a right and wrong. That I'll stay away from that. Let's not get into a debate on that. But there's you really had shown you made you were on with N.T. Wright. And you really showed in this conversation with N.T. Wright how the Roman road system was this new technology that allowed Christianity to spread. And you made the connection that this new technology of the internet, it's almost like this new faith is using some of the same powers of this new technology, and not just using the technology, but going to the governments. Like Paul demands to be brought before Caesar, because he doesn't just want to convert your everyday person. He wants to bring this to the powers of the world. And what you see now with the internet, and then you're seeing in the heads of government, this almost like this new faith taking hold with, I don't know if you call it wokeism or whatever it is, but to me, it almost seems like a typological fulfillment in the negative. And you're seeing this new faith emerge in a very similar way to the way Christianity took off.
I think that Christianity has always taken advantage of new means of communication. So absolutely, the Roman road system is clearly crucial to the spread of Christianity. And actually, Eusebius, who writes the first history of the Christian church in the early 4th century and is the biographer of Constantine, he makes exactly this point. He says that it's, he attributes it to divine providence that all the world had been joined by the Romans, so that people, Christian missionaries could effectively travel anywhere that they wanted. And then, of course, in the 16th and 17th century, the invention of the printing press is fundamental to the spread of Protestantism and to all the various subdivisions of Protestantism as well. And I think that now the internet is playing an analogous role in what I think is a kind of cultural, moral, ethical upheaval, very analogous to the Protestant Reformation. I think the 60s are, a decade of importance comparable to the 1520s. And I think that what we're living through now is a kind of fresh iteration of what was Christianity. But the difference is that for the first time, Christian beliefs and assumptions and values have been separated from the kind of the apparatus of scripture and church going and doctrine that gave them birth. And so now all you have basically is a kind of vibe. It's the vibe that matters, not doctrine. And what we're seeing is basically an attempt to yoke these vibes, to kind of find vehicles for these vibes that are no longer Christian. So hence, the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matter or whatever. These are patently, they only make sense in the context of a Christian culture, but they're casting, George Floyd as the equivalent of a martyr. Someone put to death, an innocent man put to death by the security apparatus of a great power. I mean, that's exactly what Jesus is.
Yeah. Yeah, I see like um I see like after the like you were saying, like people that don't grasp that, like, so you have the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, but then you have the Council of Trent to counter it. And Trent, as a Catholic, that Trent says, okay, we have to straighten some of these things out. Then you have the revolution in the 60s, the sexual revolution, and the church calls a council, but they don't address any of the actual problems going on in the culture in the Second Vatican Council. They should have been addressing the sexual revolution, and instead they're talking about ecumenism, and they're talking about our relation to this and to that. And I think that was a big letdown from the part of the Catholic Church.
I mean, the thing is that I think that Christianity is inherently convulsive and rebellious and transformative. The idea that it has always been the same, I think, seems to me a nonsense. In one sense, of course, it always has been, because there's a body of writings and of values that clearly do go back to the beginnings of the faith. But at the same time, the idea, so the kind of this primal idea of the last being first and the first being last, the problem for Christians has always been that inevitably you get elites, and these elites generate kickback. So whether it's in the 11th century with the revolutionaries who seized control of the commanding heights of the Roman Church and use their power, this revolutionary power, to strip kings and emperors of the sacral quality that they had always previously had, and establish this unbelievably revolutionary institution, the Roman Church, in the Middle Ages. But the people who have seized control of those commanding heights, they generate reaction, because there are lots of people who feel that the revolution hasn't gone far enough. And in the 16th century, you get a kind of kickback. You get a kind of fresh iteration of reformatio, of revolution, the Reformation. But it's not the Reformation, it's just another one. And in a sense, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the 60s Revolution are all fresh iterations of that. So basically, to construct a civilization on Christian grounds is like building a city on the San Andreas Fault.
Yeah.
You are going to get earthquakes. Earthquakes are going to come. Buildings are going to be shattered. They may survive. You may be able to rebuild it. You may be able to put them on fresh foundations. But that process of convulsive change is going to come. And that's why, the Reformation is such a challenge for the church that we come to call the Catholic Church, because in a sense, Catholicism is not as old as Protestantism, because Catholicism exists in the context of Protestantism. And likewise, now what we're going through as a society, the Christian churches are having to reorient and re-identify themselves in the light of what is fast becoming the hegemonic way of understanding the world, which is a kind of post-Christian, secularist, materialist understanding of how the universe should function, but which is still absolutely kind of motored by Christian values and assumptions. So
we would have, okay, so you made a comment with the Bishop Barron conversation when you sat with Bishop Barron, and you said, I'm sure as a Catholic, you would see the natural end of atheism is the natural end of Protestantism. And that really is how a Catholic would see it. It's like, once you,
I think that's true.
Once it really is, I mean, that's a bias I have, obviously, right? It's like, I'm a Catholic, so I do see the first revolt from it. So,
but I mean, I would also say that Protestantism is a logical corollary of Catholicism.
Yeah.
It's not like Protestantism comes from nowhere. Protestantism is a kind of radicalization of impulses that were channeled by Gregory VII and his fellow reformers in the 11th century. And ultimately, those impulses go back to the Gospels and to Isaiah and to the stories of the Old Testament. The desire to overthrow idolatry, to banish superstition, to bring people into the light. This is something that motivates, the early church under Gregory the Great and his successors. It motivates Luther and Calvin, and it motivates people today. It motivates Richard Dawkins and
it's funny how
kind of the new atheists.
It's funny how you say that, because atheism really doesn't exist without Christianity. The Christian civilization is the only civilization that ever produced something called atheism. There's no, so
Well,
like
no, there are atheists in the Greek world.
Individual, but not as a culture.
Right,
where,
not as a culture. You're absolutely right. But I mean, I think that, there's this thing called convergent evolution where, say, pterosaurs and birds and bats all develop winged flight, but they're not related to each other. I mean, they are ultimately, but they're not they haven't evolved from one another. And I think that you're right that the atheism in the modern world owes nothing to Greek philosophy.
Yeah.
It's entirely Christian.
Yeah. So what is your difference? Because I'm going to let you go. We got about 5 minutes left, but how has your understanding of Catholicism itself, because you grew up in an Anglican tradition. I'm sure you had your prejudices against the Catholic faith.
I completely did. I remember the first time I went to Rome, and I saw a cardinal, and my assumption was he was off to poison a nunnery. So I kind of grew up.
Might not have been so wrong there.
Well, maybe not. So my wife was baptized Catholic, and then her parents were so appalled at the idea of original sin, because it was the 60s when everyone was going against the idea of original sin, that they spectacularly lost their faith in the way that Catholics often seem to. And then my wife's mother died, and I think she wanted to get in touch with her mother and what had made her mother, because her mother had been very devoutly Catholic. And so she started going to church, and the local church was a Jesuit church. And I,
the Jesuits, right?
I was sufficiently steeped in Tudor propaganda to know that they did no good and just wanted to poison Queen Elizabeth and all that kind of thing. And I found that they were wonderful. They were completely inspirational, kind of brilliantly, dazzlingly pastoral and intellectual figures. So I really enjoyed getting to know them. And also the parish priest, Father Tom Hennigan, and I name him so that perhaps your listeners could keep him in their prayers, was the holiest person I'd ever met. He was a wonderful, wonderful man, kind, compassionate. I mean, he was just wonderful, and died of a heart attack about 7 years ago. And at his wake, everybody went and thought that they had been particularly special to him, and discovered that they'd all been special to him.
Yeah.
And the parish that he ran is a part of Brixton, which is a kind of inner city area with people from every corner of the world. So it was properly Catholic. So there were, people from the uppermost elites, and there were people who had been slaves in the Sudan and Eritrea. So, I mean, all humanity was there, and he was loved by all of them. So that kind of instinctive English Protestant suspicion of Catholicism, which I realized I had absolutely inherited, has gone. And the experience then of writing Dominion and appreciating just how much all of us in the West owe to the achievements of Catholic saints, philosophers, teachers, jurists, whatever, has only reinforced that.
Yeah, I think what I found was, I find the first several chapters of your book to be a Catholic apologetic. Like, I really do. I really do.
So I would say that there has criticism from lots of Catholic readers has been that it's very recognizably a Protestant book, and I wouldn't deny that. I mean, I think it is
well, you're going to go into it with a, you can't help your upbringing, right? But I still saw it as a Catholic apologetic, as really showing how the Catholic Church was really unified, and there wasn't these, I really, I mean, as a Catholic, I really did love this book. And the one thing I do have to say is, as I'm reading the chapter on Luther, it's very funny because you know the end of the story. But as Luther is getting summoned to Rome to speak with Cajetan, I'm still in my heart hoping against hope that maybe Cajetan can convert Luther. And it's like, I'm like, come on, you can do this. It's such a strange thing to read a story where you already know the conclusion of, and you're still hoping against hope against it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do think that there you could imagine ways in which Luther might have been reconciled.
Yeah.
I mean, I think
there were a lot of
he was
forces
onto
behind it.
issues that perhaps
needed to be addressed,
and under different circumstances could have been resolved.
Yeah. Well, Tom, I can't listen. I know I can't thank you enough. I'm so grateful. When you actually first had to cancel our interview, and you said, something came up on Monday, and I'm not kidding. It felt like a death in the family. I was grieving.
I'm really sorry
No,
about that. I'm off to that great powerhouse of Protestantism, Amsterdam.
So listen, when you told me you could reschedule for Saturday, I was so beyond grateful. You were really I know we have nothing to offer you. We're a small channel, but hopefully your treasure in heaven is you get a little reward of treasure in heaven for recognizing this small, tiny channel like us. But Tom, seriously, I really do think you're a wonderful thinker. I really love hearing all of the talks that you've given, and also Tom hosts a podcast called "The Rest Is History" with a friend of his, Brian. What's his last name?
Dominic Sambrook.
Dominic.
Oh, Dominic. I'm sorry.
Where'd Brian come from?
I might call
Dominic.
him
So
Brian.
please, guys, go check out "The Rest Is History." Read Dominion. I'm going to actually go back and read the book that you spoke about with the origins of Islam. Tom, really, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much for giving us your time. You're really
absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And please, I hope you keep me muted on Twitter because I am a bit bombastic on there, and it's
no, not at all. Not at all. Very good to meet you.
Tom, thank you
have a good weekend.
You too.
Tom.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye.